The moment always arrived with the shift of light, when the ambitious fluorescence of Vanguard solutions yielded to the deep, silent blue of the city night. Mr. Walter Reed, a man whose presence had been deliberately faded by time and choice, began his nightly pilgrimage across the marble expanse. The sound of his buffer, a low mechanical prayer, was the only witness to the company's secrets. Walter wore his uniform, a pale, functional grey, like a second skin, a skin designed for anonymity. He was 70 years old, but his movements held the careful economic strength of a man who understood leverage better than any young financier in the building. He was, to everyone here, simply a fixture, like the potted palms or the fire extinguisher, necessary but utterly devoid of personality. Tonight, the quiet was violently interrupted. 3 figures, sleek and sharp as razor wire, stumbled out of a late-night strategy session on the 30th floor. They were the executive elite, fueled by the intoxicating confidence of youth and unearned power. At the front was Jake, the CEO, a man who saw the world not as a complex system of humanity, but as a ladder to be climbed over others. Jake stopped by the glass railing overlooking the atrium, phone pressed to his ear, his voice booming with the faux calm of someone trying desperately to impress an unseen audience. Walter was maneuvering his machine near the atrium entrance, attempting to minimize his presence, but the machine's steady hush was, to Jake, an auditory offense. He swung around, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking impatiently on the polished stone. "Can you turn that infernal thing off, old man?" Jake commanded, his voice dripping with annoyance, not malice, which was far worse. Malice implies recognition. This was just pure, careless dismissal. "I'm closing a high-priority deal. I can't hear myself think over the sound of your chores." Walter immediately stopped the machine, his old hands tightening instinctively on the metal handlebars. The silence rushed in, vast and sudden. He stood there, framed in the powerful, recessed lighting of the lobby. Jake didn't look at Walter's face. He didn't even acknowledge the quick obedience. He simply continued his call, pacing, weaving a web of financial jargon and aggressive promises. The 2 subordinates with him, Mark and Trevor, exchanged a quick, amused glance. They saw a comedy in progress, the powerful executive reprimanding the meek servant. The call ended abruptly. Jake's mood soured instantly. The deal was clearly hitting a snag. His frustration needed an immediate outlet, and Walter, static and silent, became the target. "Look at you," Jake sneered, his voice dropping to a theatrical stage whisper intended to be heard by his companions. 70 years old. Still pushing a mop. Is this the payoff for all that effort, Walter? A lifetime of cleaning up other people's messes? One of the young men snickered. The other offered a weak, nervous laugh that quickly died under Walter's steady, unblinking gaze. Jake reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick wad of bills, and peeled off a $50 note, not a 20, but 50, making the gesture far more insulting. He crumpled it violently in his fist, then flicked it with a casual, brutal force onto the clean marble, where it bounced twice before settling near Walter's worn work boots. "Here," Jake spat, the sound heavy with contempt. "Buy yourself a new life, if you can still remember what that feels like." The executives turned their backs and walked towards the security exit, their laughter sharp, the kind that cuts without blood. Walter didn't move. The crumpled $50 bill lay there, an obscene, gaudy monument to their casual cruelty. The heat on his neck was a physical, stinging sensation, a chemical reaction to the public shaming. I remember that day. No one looked at me as a person. They didn't see the man who once negotiated billion-dollar contracts at this very spot. They saw a failure, a cautionary tale, a piece of the furniture. The pain was not the insult itself, but the profound loneliness of being utterly unseen, of having your entire past erased by the sheer blinding arrogance of a successor who believed his own myth. Walter's breath hitched, a silent, deep wound that went straight to the core of his dignity. He stood still, letting the anger settle, allowing the bitter taste of injustice to clarify his resolve. He lowered his head, his gaze sweeping over the opulent lobby. It was a museum of his sacrifice, a shell built around a vision he had almost died for. His eyes settled on the brass plaque, the founders' names. He knew every curve of that etched lettering, every glint of that polished metal. Walter Reed was the first name, the patriarch. He reached down, his fingers thickened and worn, but still possessing the sensitivity of a master craftsman, grazing the cold, hard floor right next to the crumpled bill. He didn't pick up the money. Instead, he slowly, deliberately picked up a single, almost invisible thread of lint that had escaped the buffer. He held it up, a speck of forgotten dirt in the vast, clean space. It was a metaphor. They were focused on the vast, chaotic sweep of the market, while he still understood the value of the smallest, most overlooked detail. The moment of decision arrived, quiet and absolute. Walter slowly put the piece of lint in his pocket, a silent vow. He left the $50 bill where it was, a marker of the night's injustice. He restarted his machine, but the hum now carried a different note, a deeper, more purposeful resonance. It was the sound of action, not submission. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the building's upper floors, where the lights were still burning in the executive suites. They thought they had seen the lowest point of his life. They had not. They had just witnessed the moment he decided to reclaim it. He was not just sweeping their dust, he was gathering his evidence. The strength in his hands returned, the tremor gone, replaced by the steady, unshakable resolve of a man who held the secret of the entire structure in his memory. He knew every crack, every weakness, every vulnerability. The janitor was gone. In his place stood the silent architect, ready to rebuild his ruin. They had no idea who I really was. But destiny was already listening, and it was about to make a profound, powerful move. The game they thought they were playing was about to change. The laughter had faded, leaving only the vast, echoing silence of the marble hall. Walter stood for a long time, bathed in the cool, blue-white light of the office, his reflection shimmering faintly in the polished floor. The insult of the $50 bill was a minor sting, easily forgotten. The real injury was the dismissal of his life's value, the casual annihilation of his decades of effort. The memory of the company's earliest days, a time of shared sacrifice and pure visionary hope, surged through him with a powerful, almost painful clarity. I remember that day. No one looked at me as a person. That phrase echoed because it was the core truth of his current existence, a man erased, a founder made invisible. This was the moment Walter shed the meekness he had adopted out of respect for his own private vow. He recalled a parallel moment of judgment from the past, a brief, cutting exchange with an overzealous board member decades ago, a man who had questioned Walter's cautious approach to expansion. Walter had stood firm then, arguing that a company's soul was more valuable than a temporary stock surge. The memory was a sharp contrast to the present. The arrogance was the same, but the object of contempt had changed. Now, the contempt was for him, the very embodiment of the company's original solid foundation. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, who used to joke that Walter's truest talent was not in finance, but in seeing the worth of the things everyone else dismissed, a worn-out tool, a discarded idea, a quiet person. Eleanor's voice, a soft, guiding murmur in his memory, urged him not to retreat, but to observe. Walter walked slowly to the water cooler, his movements deliberate, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm in his chest. He took a small plastic cup and filled it, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the massive, internal shift of resolve. This small, involuntary tremor was the only outward sign of the turmoil within. He raised the cup to his lips, but didn't drink, just stared into the clear, cold water. He was seeing not his reflection, but the younger Jake standing in the boardroom mocking him. He saw the easy, entitled confidence that had replaced the hungry, honest ambition he and his partners had once shared. This feeling of impotent shame was unacceptable. He had lived his life by a code of honor, a code that now demanded he step out of the shadows. The price of his anonymity had become the near destruction of his legacy. The memory intensified, growing richer, more visual. He remembered the exact moment he decided to step down. It wasn't a corporate maneuver, it was a deeply personal retreat. Eleanor's illness was sudden and cruel, and the high-pressure world of Vanguard, the endless meetings and compromises, had begun to feel meaningless, a chaotic distraction from the one thing that truly mattered. He had chosen love and presence over power and profit. His retirement was swift, silent and deeply undervalued by his partners at the time, who saw his exit as a weak emotional capitulation. He had signed the documents, including the crucial obscure trust clause, on the eve of Eleanor's final diagnosis. He had sworn to her that they would live the rest of their time together simply, purely, without the gilded cage of corporate life. He kept the promise until her last breath. He took the janitor job because the building itself was a connection to her, a monument to their shared history. He needed to be near the structure, even if he was now only tending its dust. Walter moved from the lobby to the dimly lit corridor of the lower offices, his machine now humming again, a rhythmic, grounding force. He swept the floor of the break room, his gaze falling upon a discarded copy of Forbes magazine. Jake was on the cover, his arms crossed, his smile predatory, the headline boasting of Vanguard's aggressive new direction. Walter stared at the image, then reached out and gently folded the magazine, not tearing it, but respecting the printed paper. He saw the same hunger in Jake's eyes that he had felt 40 years prior, but mixed with a dangerous, corrosive narcissism. He recognized the ambition, but also the fundamental instability it masked. He realized Jake wasn't evil. He was simply small, incapable of carrying the historical weight of the company. He was in the deep, silent archives next, a vast, climate-controlled space that housed the physical record of the company's existence. He paused by a locked fireproof cabinet. He didn't need a key. He knew the subtle, almost imperceptible way the lock mechanism was misaligned, a detail only the man who had installed the cabinet years ago would remember. His hands, though aged, still held the fine motor memory of a former engineer. He opened the cabinet with a silent, minute click. Inside, on the top shelf, was a simple, sealed box, the contents of his original CEO desk. He reached in and pulled out one item, a small, smooth riverstone, worn perfectly round by time and water. Eleanor had given it to him the day Vanguard first opened, a physical reminder that true strength lies in resilience and patience, not sharpness. He ran his thumb over the stone, a profound feeling of centeredness washing over him. The stone was a talisman, a connection to his truest self. Walter held the stone in his pocket, a silent, cool weight against his thigh. He felt the full force of his conviction return. He had been hurt, humiliated, and reduced to a silent observer, but the pain had cleansed his vision. He had chosen humility, but they had chosen contempt. Now the balance must be restored. He had all the necessary components, the decades of institutional knowledge, the secret financial mechanisms of his trust, and the moral clarity born from his years of anonymity. He pushed his cleaning machine out of the archives, back toward the main artery of the building. His stride was longer, his spine straighter. He knew the building was structurally unsound, thanks to Jake's greed, and he knew he was the only architect left who could save the blueprint. He didn't need to shout his intentions. The mere resumption of his methodical, deliberate work was a powerful statement. He was cleaning the building, yes, but he was also organizing the evidence for the inevitable corporate cleanup. The game of invisibility was over. He was about to make his presence known in a way that would shatter the world of the arrogant executives. They had no idea who I really was, but tomorrow the janitor would sign their paychecks. The life Walter Reed currently led was not a penance for failure, but a pilgrimage of profound, voluntary simplicity. His small, impeccably neat apartment, miles away from the glass towers of Vanguard, was a gallery of true worth. Old, leather-bound books, a meticulously kept woodworking bench, and central to everything, a simple framed portrait of Eleanor. This portrait was the key to his humility. It was here, in the quiet evenings, that the full, powerful narrative of Walter's past unfolded, a story not of corporate conquest, but of shared human ambition. We flash back to the 1970s. Walter, a brilliant working-class kid with a math degree and a relentless work ethic, meeting Eleanor, a compassionate social worker with an unwavering belief in ethical business. They started Vanguard in a cramped rented office above a hardware store, not to conquer the market, but to prove that finance could be practiced with integrity. The memory was vibrant. Walter, in an ill-fitting suit, drawing complex revenue models on a whiteboard. Eleanor, making coffee and reminding him that every client, regardless of portfolio size, was a human being with a dream. His initial ambition was fierce, yes, but it was anchored entirely by Eleanor's moral compass. The reason for his deep adopted humility was the sacred promise he made to her. For 20 years, Vanguard soared. Walter became a titan, powerful and respected, but the cost was perpetual exhaustion. Then the crisis, Eleanor's sudden diagnosis. The fast-moving illness brought their high-speed life to a screeching halt. Walter realized, with terrifying clarity, that the multi-billion-dollar empire he had built was a poor substitute for the 20 minutes he had left with his wife. His decision to step down was instant and absolute. He sold the majority stake to his protégé, a man he believed possessed the competence, if not the empathy, to carry the torch. Walter insisted on the secret, unusual clause in the sale agreement, an irrevocable trust containing convertible preferred shares and the right to lifetime employment in any capacity. This was not a power play, it was a lifeboat, a final act of fiduciary duty to the company's integrity should it ever veer toward ruin, and a secure, humble income stream for him and Eleanor. He wanted out of the power game, to focus completely on her. After her passing, the world of the ultra-wealthy felt hollow and cold. He chose the janitor job, a choice rooted in grief and honor, to be physically present in the only structure that truly represented their life together, and to live out the simple promise they had shared. Walter's routine as the janitor was a study in pure, unadulterated kindness, a direct contrast to the transactional cruelty of the executives. His bond with the invisible ones of the building, the security guards, the catering staff, the other cleaners, was one of quiet, mutual respect. He knew the name of every single person who wore a service uniform, a simple courtesy that meant more than a bonus check. One chilly Tuesday, he found a young security guard, David, shivering on his night shift. Without a word, Walter returned with a sealed thermos of his own homemade warm-spiced cider, a small act of warmth that David never forgot. His routine was a pattern of mending small, broken things, oiling a squeaky hinge on a door no one else cared about, replacing the burned-out light in the stairwell that management had ignored for weeks, quietly leaving a jar of hand salve in the women's restroom for the cleaning crew. These were his acts of stewardship, the silent maintenance of the human soul within the concrete and glass. But the small injustices continued, a persistent, draining tide of disrespect. The younger staff, utterly blind to the quiet dignity of work, loved to make Walter the subject of their casual cruelty. A group of analysts gathered by the coffee machine one afternoon, loudly discussing their investment portfolios. One, a loudmouthed finance major named Eric, gestured dismissively toward Walter, who was emptying a trash bin a few feet away. "That's what happens when you plateau, man," Eric said, loud enough for Walter to hear. "No risk, no reward. He's just surviving. We're thriving." The comparison, the cruel juxtaposition of their soaring, shallow ambition against Walter's quiet, dedicated labor was designed to make them feel superior. They judged the book by the cover of the uniform, never realizing that the man they mocked had forgotten more about building real value than they would ever learn from a textbook. Their contempt was for his poverty, but his reality was one of unimaginable, guarded wealth. A powerful shift occurred during a moment of crisis, underscoring Walter's genuine character. The company had hired Lila, the young intern, fresh out of university, her eyes bright with earnest ambition. One night, a pipe burst in a sub-level server room, a panic-inducing emergency. The IT team was frantic, and Jake, instead of offering help, simply shouted commands over the phone from a safe distance, afraid of getting his shoes wet. Walter, hearing the commotion, immediately descended. He didn't wait for instructions. He assessed the flooding, located the archaic, manually operated shut-off valve, and using his knowledge from the building's original blueprint, which he helped design, navigated the dark, flooded corridor. He risked the electric shock and the rising water, not for recognition, but to save the company's core data. He found the valve, a rusting piece of original machinery, and with effort stopped the flow. Lila, standing petrified by the entrance, witnessed the entire event. She saw the agility and courage of the old man and the total panicked paralysis of the leaders. When he emerged, soaked and shivering but successful, Lila rushed forward, not to praise him, but to hand him a warm, dry towel and thank him simply for his bravery. That shared moment of risk and genuine human care forged a small, unbreakable alliance between the founder and the future. The rising tide of financial distress, which the young executives dismissed as market volatility, was a terrifying clarity to Walter. He watched Jake's frantic energy and saw the reckless, short-sighted decisions he was making. Aggressive loans, over-leveraged acquisitions, and a total disregard for the balance sheet. Walter started his own silent investigation. His janitor route was the perfect surveillance path. He found discarded drafts of panicked emails, overheard hushed, angry conversations with creditors, and most damningly, located a complex legal document tucked into a recycling bin that outlined a massive, undisclosed liability. The company was hemorrhaging cash, and Jake was masking the wounds with lies. Walter, the true architect, saw that the structure was compromised. His simple, protective intention, to be near his legacy, was shifting into a critical, necessary intervention. The quiet, almost invisible movement of fate solidified one evening. Walter was alone in the executive library, supposedly dusting the vast collection of financial history. He knelt by a seldom-used bookshelf and reached behind a row of heavy, forgotten volumes. His fingers found the small, almost imperceptible seam in the wood paneling, a secret hiding place he had built decades ago. He pulled a small latch, and a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a small, recessed safe. Inside, nestled beneath a simple letter from Eleanor, was the original gold-stamped corporate ledger. More importantly, there was a detailed, heavily red-lined appendix to his original retirement papers. This document detailed the full structure of the Walter Reed Irrevocable Trust and the exact conditions for the conversion of his non-voting preferred shares into a controlling, voting interest. The conditions were specific: a sustained downturn below a defined liquidity ratio and a documented attempt to mislead the board. Jake's recent actions had triggered both clauses. Walter closed the safe, the small click sealing not a secret, but a destiny. He wasn't just observing the ruin, he was holding the keys to the company's rescue and the necessary final act of poetic justice. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Vanguard Tower was subtly, profoundly different. The executives arrived, their coffee steam mingling with the cold air of the atrium. Jake, exhausted from another night spent desperately reworking failed financial models, was among the first. His eyes were bloodshot, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, a visual indication of the stress that was beginning to erode his polished facade. As he passed the spot where he had performed his cruel act of charity, he paused. The crumpled $50 bill was gone. But in its place, centered perfectly on the marble, was a single, flat, perfectly folded $20 bill. It was clearly his, the currency he had used in a similar arrogant transaction months earlier, a precise, calculated return. It wasn't money. It was a psychological marker, a silent note of rejection. Jake stared at it, his mind racing. Who had switched the bills? Why? The 50 was an insult, a throwaway gesture. The 20 was a message. It suggested that someone not only witnessed his public humiliation, but had also taken the time to correct the amount, thereby emphasizing the exact, remembered offense. The quiet pride Jake usually carried shattered. He looked around the vast lobby, but saw only the usual morning blur: the doorman, the security guard, a few early commuters. He snatched the 20, feeling a flush of raw, exposed anger, and shoved it deep into his pocket. The janitor, Walter, was nowhere in sight. He had finished his shift hours ago, but Jake felt his unseen, judging presence everywhere. He didn't understand the game, but he suddenly realized he was being watched, and the observer held a clarity that was terrifyingly absolute. The first move of the silent war had been made, but it was Lila, the earnest intern, who saw the pattern emerging. She had been haunted by Walter's bravery during the server room flood. She sought him out on the ground floor, finding him methodically cleaning the rarely used fire escape stairwell, the ultimate symbol of neglected infrastructure. She approached him not with pity, but with a plea for knowledge. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice soft but firm, "you saved the core data the other night. You knew where that valve was and no one else did. You see things we don't. The company, it's not right. The numbers are worse than anyone is admitting. Can you help me understand?" Walter stopped his scrubbing. He looked at her, not with the empty eyes of the janitor, but with the sharp, deep gaze of the founder. He saw in her the exact moral clarity he and Eleanor had valued. She cared about the structure, not the status. Their conversation, conducted over the sound of a slow-running faucet in the staff washroom, became the founding moment of their secret alliance. Walter didn't reveal his identity, not yet. He spoke in riddles and metaphors drawn from his cleaning trade. "A polished surface hides the cracks," he told her, gently rubbing a faint scratch from a stainless steel sink. "But the corrosion starts underneath. It starts with a lazy broom, skipping the corners, and ends with a compromised foundation." He gave her a single, actionable instruction, a crucial piece of counter-surveillance advice. "Look not at the projections, Lila. Look at what they throw away, and watch the windows." The simple advice unlocked a new reality for Lila. She realized the paper trail wasn't on the company server, but in the recycling. She started monitoring the executive waste bins, finding discarded notes, red-lined contracts, and, most tellingly, hastily printed internal memos detailing the liquidation of non-core assets, sales Jake had sworn were not happening. Walter's anonymous guidance had turned the intern into a silent, deeply moral investigator, working in the shadows of the executive's self-destruction. The financial crisis, which Walter had meticulously documented, was now raging out of control. Jake, in a desperate last-ditch effort to raise cash, had committed Vanguard to a toxic, high-interest bridge loan secured against the company's long-term intellectual property. The one asset Walter and Eleanor had made legally difficult, almost impossible, to leverage. The deal was set to close at the end of the week, and if it failed, Vanguard would face immediate insolvency, followed by a fire sale liquidation. The board was set to convene in an emergency session on Friday. The meeting was Jake's last stand, where he planned to present a fraudulent, optimistic recovery forecast, betting his entire career on a final, desperate lie. Walter, meanwhile, was using his ultimate form of invisibility, his intimate, decades-long knowledge of the building's technological nervous system. He didn't need to hack the network. He was the network's ghost. He knew the hidden access points, the decommissioned server ports in the walls, the old wiring closets that the modern IT department had forgotten existed. One night, while supposedly repairing a faulty motion sensor in the 30th floor hallway, he accessed an old abandoned utility port. He connected a small, custom-built device, a creation of his own engineering skill, a silent, passive listener that only tracked metadata, not content. He was tracking the timestamps and locations of Jake's most sensitive email communications, building a precise chronological map of the cover-up. He noticed a persistent pattern. All sensitive communication was routed through a private server Jake had set up outside Vanguard's firewall, using a heavily encrypted personal email address. Walter could not access the content, but the location and timing of the transmissions were enough to prove intent to deceive. The janitor was quietly building the ultimate unassailable legal case against the CEO. The escalating stress caused Jake's paranoia to spike. He started to see conspirators everywhere, especially after another silent message appeared. A highly complex financial chart, drawn not on a whiteboard, but on the dust of his own enormous unused conference table. The chart precisely mapped the company's true negative liquidity ratio, a number only visible in the deep, unreleased ledgers. Jake was stunned. The calculation was flawless. He immediately ordered security to change all the locks, install new internal cameras, and most ironically, to hire an additional cleaning crew to work during the day, hoping to flush out the night shift ghost. This act of overcorrection was a critical mistake. The new security measures were a chaotic distraction, and the temporary daytime cleaning crew was sloppy, leaving more clues than they concealed. Jake's arrogance had given Walter a new, more crowded shadow to work from. Walter realized he needed a final, irrefutable act of internal sabotage that would force the truth into the open before the board meeting. Jake's plan was to use a hard copy, bound copy of the recovery plan to brief the board, a document filled with optimistic lies. Walter knew the location of the print run, the locked, high-security print room on the 5th floor. During his shift, Walter entered the print room using the old, forgotten maintenance code he himself had established decades ago. He didn't destroy the report. That would simply allow Jake to print a fresh copy. Instead, Walter used his knowledge of the specific, vintage industrial printer's internal settings. He subtly recalibrated the printer's toner cartridge and paper feed mechanism, creating a nearly invisible, minute misalignment. When the massive 100-page documents were printed and bound the next morning, every single page was off by less than a millimeter. The text remained legible, but the margins were subtly skewed, and more crucially, the graph lines in the financial charts did not line up precisely with the axis labels. The report now subtly screamed fraud, signaling a fundamental lack of precision and care. It was a masterpiece of silent, psychological sabotage, designed to trigger the suspicion of the highly analytical board members before they even read the content. The confrontation was now set, but Walter had one final crucial piece of human business to conduct. He found Lila working late, surrounded by the incriminating paper trail she had collected from the recycling bins, the evidence he had instructed her to find. She was overwhelmed, her eyes tired but alight with conviction. She knew the company was being lied to, but she had no voice. Walter walked up to her, his shadow falling across the desk, and placed a single sealed envelope in front of her. The envelope was heavy, formal, and sealed with the company's original brass-stamped seal, a design only the founder would possess. "You have the truth, Lila," he said, his janitor's voice dropping to a low, commanding register that carried the weight of the past. "Now you have the voice. Open this when the board meeting is called to order, not before." He gave her a final, resolute look, the look of a general handing the final battle plan to his most trusted lieutenant. He turned and left, his silent, rhythmic pace carrying him away from the 30th floor for the last time as the janitor. He spent the rest of his shift cleaning, his heart pounding with the knowledge that the confrontation was imminent. The next morning, he would not be cleaning the mess. He would be exposing the ruin and offering the only solution. The envelope in Lila's hand was the key to the entire kingdom. The executive boardroom on the 30th floor was a stage set for disaster. The air was thick and cold, despite the heating. Outside, the city was masked in a dense, early-morning fog, mirroring the corporate confusion inside. The emergency board meeting was in session, called to address the looming insolvency of Vanguard Solutions. 7 board members, representing billions of dollars in invested capital, sat around the enormous mahogany table, their expressions a mixture of fear, fatigue, and barely contained fury. Jake stood at the head, presenting his fraudulent recovery plan, the document Walter had subtly sabotaged. Jake was performing his final act of self-deception. His voice, once smooth and commanding, was now edged with a thin, desperate tremor. "As you can see, the projections are solid," he insisted, gesturing wildly at the bound report. "We are facing a liquidity crunch, yes, but the proposed bridge loan, secured against non-core IP, will stabilize us. I just need a vote of confidence to finalize the commitment." But the board members were hesitant. The slight misalignment on the charts, the skewed margins, gave the entire presentation a subtle, yet deeply unnerving sense of carelessness. They were financial analysts, men and women whose entire careers were built on precision. The minute visual imperfections screamed unreliability. A subtle, cold silence began to settle as they flipped through the pages, their discomfort growing. Suddenly, Lila, the intern, entered the room carrying a tray of fresh coffee, her usual humble function. She walked with deliberate, quiet steadiness. As she placed the tray down, she caught the eye of Mr. Sterling, the company's ancient legal counsel, seated beside the board chairman. Sterling gave her an almost imperceptible confirming nod. Lila knew the moment had arrived. She pulled the sealed envelope from the pocket of her sensible black skirt, the envelope Walter had given her, stamped with the founder's original seal. She placed it next to the chairman's coffee cup, a silent, profound intrusion. "Excuse me, Chairman," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of massive consequence. "This arrived for your immediate attention. It concerns an action against Vanguard's debt structure." Jake watched the exchange, his eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "What is that, Ms. Evans? This is a private meeting. You are dismissed." The chairman, intrigued by the seal and the clear, urgent tone in the intern's eyes, ignored Jake, breaking the seal with a slow, tearing sound. He unfolded the contents, his face, already etched with worry, freezing into an expression of sheer seismic shock. He read the top line, then the bottom line, then looked up at the room, his hand shaking. "Mr. Sterling," the chairman's voice was a ragged whisper. "Is this document authentic? A notice of irrevocable share conversion?" Sterling, quiet and professional, simply confirmed, "It is, sir," filed in accordance with the 1998 corporate agreement triggered by the current liquidity crisis threshold. The air in the room became instantly colder. Jake's aggressive bridge loan was now pointless. The company was no longer his to save or sell. Before Jake could react, demanding to know the source of the conversion, the boardroom doors opened. It was not a grand entrance. It was Walter Reed, still in his grey jumpsuit, his mop and bucket conspicuously absent. He walked into the room not as a janitor, but as a man simply reclaiming his space. His spine was straight, his shoulders back, the deep weariness of his years replaced by a quiet, immovable resolve. He didn't utter a word. He walked to the window, turned, and stood perfectly still, his presence utterly dominating the room. The board members, reeling from Sterling's confirmation, looked from the shock on the chairman's face to the silent man in the uniform. The truth began to coalesce in their minds with horrifying clarity. Jake was the first to find his voice, a high-pitched, raw scream of absolute panic denial. "You, get out! You don't belong here! This is corporate property! Security!" He lunged toward Walter, his corporate composure finally exploding into base, physical fury. Before he could reach Walter, two of the older, more composed board members grabbed Jake's arms, holding him back. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that this man in the grey uniform was no longer their servant. He was their owner. Walter simply met Jake's frantic, hating gaze. He didn't need to speak. His eyes, steady, deep, and infinitely knowing, conveyed the message. "I built this. You risked it. I am taking it back." Sterling then delivered the final, crushing sentence, the full, undeniable truth. He picked up the original founder's plaque, a smaller desktop version that sat on the chairman's shelf, and walked to Walter. He held the plaque next to the man's face. "Gentlemen," Sterling announced, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge, "allow me to formally introduce the majority shareholder and the controlling principal of this company. This is the founder, Mr. Walter Reed. The trust fund that has just saved Vanguard from bankruptcy is his. He has been here, sweeping the floors, watching the ruin you allowed, while he waited for the necessary legal moment to save his legacy." The revelation was complete, total, and irreversible. The resulting silence was a profound moral vacuum. The board members weren't just shocked by the financial implications, they were shattered by the moral indictment. The man they had paid minimum wage to clean their spills, the man Jake had publicly humiliated, was the very architect of their success and the key to their immediate survival. Every single careless remark, every instance of contempt, every skipped thank you note now crashed down on them as a monumental wave of shame. Jake slumped into a leather chair, his face buried in his hands, defeated not by a hostile takeover, but by a quiet, moral truth, delivered by a man holding an irrevocable trust in one hand and the memory of a slighted honor in the other. Walter remained by the window, letting the silence do its work. It was the moment of complete, crushing reckoning, the justice that never needed a courtroom. The silence that followed Charles Sterling's announcement and Walter Reed's quiet, commanding presence was the purest form of moral cataclysm. It was a silence that held the weight of every slight, every arrogance, and every instance of careless cruelty. The boardroom, a space designed for logical, ruthless transaction, was momentarily transformed into a church of reckoning. The board members, men and women accustomed to power, were paralyzed, not by Walter's wealth, which they now understood to be astronomical, but by his profound, patient humility. They were staring at a man who had chosen to wear the uniform of the lowest-ranking employee, simply to observe the decay of his own dream. The shame was a visceral, shared experience. Jake was the most profound study in self-destruction. He didn't look up. The floor, once his stage, was now his prison. The reality of his failure was not the loss of the company, but the loss of his moral standing, exposed by the very man he had belittled for a paltry tip. Walter finally moved, his steps measured and deliberate. He walked towards the large, ornate windows, looking out over the city he had helped build. He didn't approach Jake with anger or triumph. He approached him with the weariness of a man who had seen the same flaw in himself, long ago. "Jake," Walter's voice was low, carrying a soft, sorrowful resonance. "You mistook ambition for integrity. That is a costly error in this business." He reached out, not to touch, but to gently tap the edge of the large mahogany table. This company was founded on the idea that the numbers only matter if the people generating them feel valued. You forgot the people, Jake. Walter's ultimate act of justice was not a punishment, but a profound teaching moment. He formally accepted the role of chairman, effective immediately, then turned to his lawyer. "Mr. Sterling, Jake is to be terminated for cause, but without public scandal. He will be given 30 minutes to collect his personal items. There will be no security escort. He will leave the building through the employee service entrance. He will carry his own box." This was not mercy, it was poetic, precise justice. He was forcing Jake to walk the path of the invisible, to experience the physical anonymity he had scorned. Walter then turned his full attention to the others. He didn't fire the entire board, recognizing that some of their actions were born from misdirection, not malice. Instead, he presented them with a simple handwritten mandate. "Until Vanguard's liquidity ratio is fully restored, I expect every executive once per week to perform a 2-hour shift alongside the maintenance staff. You will clean, you will serve, you will remember the foundation." The board, utterly humbled, nodded their silent assent, recognizing that the terms were less about labor and more about mandatory moral clarity. The reconciliation was quiet, driven by Lila, the young intern. Walter pulled her aside, his face softening completely. "Lila, the company needs a new heart, one that beats with integrity and empathy, not just aggression." He presented her with an immediate promotion to Chief Operating Officer and announced his intention to mentor her as the future CEO. Lila, tearful and overwhelmed, tried to refuse, pointing to her youth and inexperience. Walter smiled, a genuine warm expression that erased decades of corporate armor. "You looked me in the eye when I was only the janitor. You recognized the value of the work, not the title. That is the experience I need." He had chosen the leader who possessed the strongest moral compass, proving that his redemption was not just about the past, but about securing a humane future for the company. Walter's final and most powerful gestures were deeply personal. He spent the entire afternoon not in the executive suite, but down in the archives. He initiated the creation of the Eleanor Reed Perpetual Trust, endowing it with the vast majority of his personal wealth, the billions he had accumulated from his original stake. The trust's primary, irrevocable mandate was to fund the complete, generous healthcare and educational costs for the families of all Vanguard employees working in service and maintenance roles, the cleaners, the security guards, the catering staff. This was his true legacy, a silent, monumental reversal of the contempt he had experienced, a permanent elevation of the invisible ones. He then made a final symbolic trip to the company museum, a small, dusty corner rarely visited. He retrieved the very first, small, hand-painted sign that read Vanguard Financial Consulting and placed it in Lila's new office, an anchor to the company's humble beginnings. The next morning, the new order was established, quiet and profound. Walter, having put on a clean, if somewhat old-fashioned dark suit, walked into the vast, bustling lobby. He paused at the founder's plaque, running his hand over his name one last time. He wasn't the janitor anymore, nor was he the full-time CEO. He was the wise elder, the conscience of the company. As he headed toward the exit, he saw Jake. Jake was standing by the service entrance, holding a single, heavy cardboard box. He was wearing anonymous street clothes, his face pale, his shoulders hunched, no longer the swaggering CEO. He was, for the first time, truly alone and humble. He looked up, his eyes meeting Walter's, and the bitterness was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing understanding. Jake didn't speak about the company or the job. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out the crumpled $50 bill, the one Walter had left on the floor, now smoothed out, but still bearing the creases of its careless dismissal. He held it out, not as repayment, but as a symbolic surrender. "I thought that money was the most valuable thing, Mr. Reed," Jake said, his voice a thick, emotionless rasp. "I thought you were nothing because you chose to clean, while I chose to take. I know now. I saw what you built and what I almost destroyed." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He offered only the truth of his learned lesson. Walter did not take the money. He gently placed his hand over Jake's, pressing the bill back into his palm. "Keep it, Jake," Walter advised, his voice soft, almost a father's guidance. "Keep it as a reminder of the cheapest mistake you ever made. Go find a company you can build from the ground up, not one you can only manage from the top down. And never, ever forget to look the janitor in the eye." Walter walked out onto the street, the sun washing over his face. He was finally free, his mission of rescue and redemption complete. He looked back at the Vanguard Tower, no longer seeing a place of personal pain, but a beacon of renewed integrity, guided by the young, empathetic leadership of Lila. His story wasn't about vengeance. It was about the profound, spiritual weight of choosing humanity over hubris. He was simply Walter Reed, walking away from the noise and the power, content to know that the deepest, most necessary cleanup was complete. The ultimate triumph was not the acquisition of billions, but the restoration of a single, forgotten principle. The greatest power is found not in what you own, but in what you choose to serve. True redemption is quiet, total, and never, ever needs to shout. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and carry this thought with you. Sometimes the most magnificent heroes are those we are too busy to notice, working in the shadows until destiny calls them into the light. Always look up, for the greatest lessons are often delivered in a simple grey uniform.